Hello, everybody. Welcome. Sometime back in probably the 1990s, possibly before that, not sure exactly what time this took place, a rather maniacal prodigy um, who was deeply involved with psychedelic drugs, particularly DMT and psilocybin. A man named Terence McKenna, whose brother is also an interesting cat. He began to speculate that there would be a temporal catastrophe. And he set the date for this catastrophe in 2012, which was then still the fairly distant but near-term future. Our archaeologists and anthropologists have led us to believe that previous civilizations have collapsed. We don't know exactly what destroyed them. And we don't have, whoever we is, our archaeologists and anthropologists is what I mean by we. So if I use that term, that's what I'll be meaning for the moment. We don't know precisely when they fell, what the causal factors in their collapse were, though we may have some vague ideas. And there have been collapses like this throughout recorded history and probably before recorded history, although what we think of as recorded history probably demarcates the origin of cities and, you know, the forms of civilization which have become hyperbolically exaggerated in our modernity. Oh, by the way, in case you don't know what it looks like, this is chamomile, that tea that so many of us love. And when it's brighter, the petals rise up, and when it's dimmer, they shrink down a bit, like you see them now. But that's chamomile, wild chamomile. And this is salvia. This is a salvia. And those are nasturtiums, which have a very wasabi-like taste. And this is borage. And that's rosemary. So, even the idea that a civilization is a discrete or distinguishable thing is a linguistic tool. It's a linguistic convenience. And yet, it's reasonable, I think, for us to suppose that the civilizations of the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Egyptians and the Greeks and so on, they underwent collapses. There's lots of different theories about this. Collapses meaning like everybody died or went away. They stopped building cities. Now, in some cases, like in South America and such, there are situations where colonists showed up and basically just started wiping shit out, wiping people out, obliterating them. But it's not clear that that was the cause of the Mayans going away. I think they died before the colonists got there, though I may have that wrong. I'm not an expert on the topic, and by all means correct me in the comments if I get something wrong. I like to correct myself and continue to learn, rather than just thinking I know what's going on. There's some other people who have theorized that there are something like solar seasons, and these solar seasons, there's sort of a heartbeat-like pulse in a variety of emanations from the sun. Oh, this is really cool. Wow. I'll get back to the sun in a moment. It's a beautiful little caterpillar. I very rarely see caterpillars and worms here. Sometimes, but not too often. And most of the ones I see are the pipevine swallowtails that were introduced by a young man who's an entomologist, I think, at the Museum of Life Sciences here in Golden Gate Park. So I remember reading a book. It's really a brilliant book, actually, though brilliance doesn't necessarily mean we should validate theories of the brilliant person or people. And often when we encounter theories that partake of or express genius, we should be very careful, because prodigy often carries with it a downside, right? For all that a genius may be able to see and communicate to us about their seeing, most geniuses and prodigies also suffer from peculiar deficits of intelligence, foresight, perspective, and so on. Which is an unfortunate thing in one sense. We get half the story from them, which is, I think, what happened with Einstein, actually. And then our common interpretations, our common biases, right, sort of take over the situation and can wildly mislead us or continue to cause us to have confusions. One moment. You see, when we're delivered something as staggeringly brilliant as relativity, it arises in a context of previously dominant bias, misthinking, linguistic deception, deceptions about identity, meaning, space-time, so on. So that we may find ourselves in a situation, ourselves being those of us who in general think of this thing, or think around this thing, or explore the theory, so on, elaborate it. We can find ourselves in at least as bad a trap as we were previous to its exposition, and sometimes even in a worse trap, right? I mean, that theory might be the key that allowed us to unlock the demon door of nuclear power, and other technologies that might even be more dangerous. There are no bodies of intelligent humans capable of determining what not to do with technological advancement, right? Theoretical advancement. So often when genius delivers some new astonishing view, theory, perspective, we're actually in great danger at that point. But really, I think what I wanted to talk about was this book that I read a long time ago, and I can't recall the title of it or even the author. It dealt, there was the name of Tutankhamun, the Egyptian god, was in the title. And I think a photograph of the head of the sarcophagus was on the cover. And the author was claiming that the Mayans and the Egyptians were aware of this cycling in the sun. This pulsed transformation of solar emissions that at their low points corresponded with grave catastrophes in civilizations on Earth. Interesting theory. At the time, I found it relatively compelling. But what I was talking about earlier was just that we want to take things like this with a grain of salt, particularly when there's sort of a lone prodigy who thinks they've found the key, right? And even when I read people I deeply trust who are profoundly intelligent, people like Ian McGilchrist or Julian Jaynes, Jaynes is a great example of what I'm talking about. Here's a man who's staggeringly intelligent and yet gets a lot of things wrong, which is okay, right? It's okay to make mistakes when we're trying to seek so far beyond our previous capacity that we're like pathfinding in new domains. But we need to be aware that we can be making mistakes and not make, bold, definitive proclamations about the nature of reality or time or humanity. And the reason that I'm talking about these things right now is that I'm not a huge fan of Terence McKenna. I want people to have endogenous, ecstatic, non-ordinary experience, meaning naturally evoked and invoked ecstatic experience that is from outside the ordinary scope of our humanity. I want us to have the endogenous experiences, meaning produced without the aid of intoxicants, before we toy around with psychedelic drugs and things like this, which I consider to be quite dangerous. They're dangerous in lots of different ways, and they're uniquely dangerous for different people. For example, people who have a tendency to develop schizophrenia, some people who are autistic, and some people who have who evince symptoms that we might put on the that we might think of as Asperger's-y, right, spectrum-y. Some of these people can be destroyed by psychedelics, and there are many other problems. The reason that I'm mentioning this is that McKenna was simply essentially declared psychedelics to be like the doorway not only to enlightenment, but to contact with non-human intelligence, and so on and so forth. And I think that's unimaginably reckless to do something like that. I would like us to have endogenous experiences before we take drugs that essentially force us into a state that we may or may not be in any way capable of understanding or coping with. And also, those states they're missing something that the endogenous experiences include. I remember thinking the first time I tried psychedelic drugs, I was probably 13, and I took some relatively good acid in the 1970s. Absolutely mind-blowing experience, literally. And it's not like if I could go back, I would definitively say, if I could, go back in time and do things differently, I'm not sure that I would necessarily desire to undo that experience. Though there are some things I would undo with drugs, particularly the use of marijuana in my late teens, or actually my early teens. Yeah, I would definitely undo that. No doubt about it. It's sort of like you don't get an undo when you're changing your psychology and perhaps your neurochemistry and maybe your microbiota and other things. There are some things we do that you can't undo, right? There's just no way to go back. And I think it's incredibly reckless for McKenna to tell generations of young people and adults that psychedelics are the key, the doorway, blah, blah, blah. There's no evidence of that. In fact, there's lots of evidence that's not what's going on at all. And it's a very reckless thing to do. It would be like wanting children to be playing video games before they have adventures of their own in their actual imagination, in their bodies, with their friends in the physical world, right? It's not dissimilar. I remember the first time I took LSD, I was completely blown away. It seemed like, oh my God, there's another universe that I've never seen. But at the same time, I was aware, in my own way, there's something phony about this, right? I don't trust it. And the seemingly wild insights that I'm experiencing, I can't bring them back over the gulf into the world of my ordinary experience. Even if I write them down, when I come down from the drug, what I've written looks like nonsense. It doesn't make any sense at all. So that can't be insight, right? If we have some kind of incredible non-ordinary experience that we can trust, it seems to me, and this isn't the only truth, it should be transmissible into our regular sort of ordinary waking world experience, thought, expression, speech, language, and so on. Not all of it will be. For example, even dreaming is not, explicitly not, right? Our descriptions of dreams, very unlike the actual dreaming experience. More like the skeletal remains of a linear plot, certainly not what's happening in dreaming. So there are exceptions. But I felt the psychedelic experience was an experience of the promise of something that was undelivered. And I wanted to know, what would it be like if the thing that's promised here is actually delivered? And I never had any drug experience that fulfilled that, although I did have a long-term waking world experience that fulfilled that and exceeded it by many, many factors. Though it's not my goal or purpose to discuss that experience here right now. Or those experiences, we might say. So, I think what McKenna was doing was quite reckless. And he invented a piece of software. He had this idea called Timewave 0. I think the software was called that. It was a piece of Macintosh software. That used some mathematical formulas to try to play with the possibility of predicting the wave shape of an aspect of temporality that was involved in his theories. And he pegged the date for the crash of time in 2012, which some people who have studied the Mayan calendar wow, that's intense. So one of the Cooper's hawks had landed in the tree, and one of my scrub jays followed it up there and was hanging out behind it and sort of harassing it. So yeah, he pegged the date for the collapse a possible wave of collapse of civilization at around 2012. And there was all this sort of popular media stuff with, God, what's that guy's name? Daniel Pinchbeck? Yeah. And frankly, I dismissed almost all of that as nonsensical. Though I did spend a lot of time reading about it, and I found some of what I read compelling. There's a certain kind of Western propensity to collapse something very complex into a commercializable, like saleable, deliverable product in language thought, and book sales, and lecturing, and so on. And I find this inclination both suspicious and disgusting, generally. It's not that I'm opposed to the dissemination of intelligence or useful information. It's rather that I'm made very uncomfortable by the cult-like trappings of some of these programs, projects. And also, I think I find it rather disturbing when there's a clearly kind of egoic, ego-driven agenda where somebody's seemingly trying to appear as, you know, the new Messiah or the enlightener of the people and so on. I'd rather that the personality draw back into the background and give us the information to play with, and give us some experiments we can do, you know, and try to determine for ourselves, you know, what's actually going on. I think that's Ladybird. It could be Epharos, but I think it's Ladybird. Ladybird's a little more touchy about my proximity than Epharos is. She lets the boy deal with the monster with the strange hat. So yeah, I'm kind of not a fan of that. There's a weird sort of ideological grandiosity that it just doesn't strike me well. One of the, I'm going to be a little bit mean for a moment, but just a little bit. Most of the time when people are writing, they write about what they're writing about rather than themselves, but there are exceptions to this, and one of the most interesting of them that I've recently encountered is Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Guy's an absolute genius. He spends most of his time, too much of his time, blowing his own horn, which is really tedious. No one needs that. When someone's demonstrating genius, it's obvious that they're a prodigy. They don't have to keep telling you that they're a prodigy. It's like having sex with someone and having them tell you, "I'm so great at sex," right? Well, that's not the kind of thing you have to announce, and it's like self-defeat. It defeats the whole purpose of things to announce something like that. The marathon runner isn't yelling out at the world, "I'm the best runner in this race," as they're running the race. Right? They run the fucking race. Right? You can tell who's good by who finishes when, you know? So I'm not a fan of that kind of thing. And of course I have an ego and I've experienced intellectual grandiosity and even maybe messianic grandiosity. But I recovered, you know, in various ways and became really quite humble at this point. And it's okay when insight suddenly floods the mind. There's a real danger for the ego to get a hold of that and become grandiose, right? So inflate, right? Just sort of inflate, become inflamed, swollen. So that the process of negotiating the onset of insight or awakening involves becoming aware of the dangers of this kind of inflation in process, and learning to navigate back toward the sort of middle path, right? The path of equanimity. And no one starts out perfect. We all have to learn. But some people don't learn, and they become sort of evangelists of their own perspectives and ego. And that's disappointing, because what we really want, I think, is the nectar, not the packaging, right? So in any case, I will try to locate the book and put the title of the Tutankhamun book in the description of this video, presuming I get to post it. And McKenna's books are easy to find. There are a few books by other scholars on the collapse of Mayan civilization, the Mayan calendar. Can't recall their names at the moment, but it should be easy enough again for me to locate and maybe put in the description of the video for those who are interested in looking into it. And the reason that I'm presenting all of this stuff that I'm kind of annoyed with is that I think there's been a terrible catastrophe in time. And the pandemic is one of the features in this catastrophe, but it is not the causal feature. We have this problem where the humans become very focused on one thing. So for example, they're focused on climate change, and particularly they're focused on the anthropogenic aspect of this, right? The aspect of climate change that we can, with some degree of reasonableness, ascribe to human activity, without realizing that could, and I think there is some human activity involved for sure, but without realizing that could dovetail on other processes that, like cycles in the sun, changes in the local stellar space manifold, space-time manifold, that we may not even have language or ideas about yet, right? There are lots of features of physical and relational reality that modern humans don't even have concepts for. And this is part of why some of the seeming superstitions of indigenous peoples might be more useful than science in some ways, because they're so dimensionally diverse. There's many dimensions to indigenous ways of life, I'm going to call them. But what I mean are their perspectives on the nature of being human on Earth in time-space, right, are more like dreaming. And because they're more like dreaming, they have a much vaster dimensionality, and they don't collapse down into flat. So the video got interrupted by a phone call, which turns out to be good, although I usually put my phone on airplane mode when I'm making a video. So what I was saying is, their way of life is so similar to dreaming while awake that it has this incredible dimensionality to the manifold. And if we collapse that dimensionality down to descriptions, we see what we think as moderns is probably superstitions, right? But that's the same kind of process as collapsing a dream into a description. We're not participating in the world the way that indigenous people can and do. And that way is much, much deeper than what we're used to as moderns. Us moderns, we have like this disease of descriptive consciousness. It's so rational that everything is flat. And logic evicts much of the incredibly nuanced, subtle, participatory dimensionality of experience, so that we're sort of living in dead space, right? And the older cultures, their way of being in the world is so much richer, and in many ways so much more human. And it would be nice if we could have both, right? And if we had both, the one that would dominate would not be the rational. It would be the participatory, right? So in any case, something is really fucked up in the world. And it has been for quite some time. And I was thinking the other day it would be really funny if Terence McKenna just got the last two numbers wrong, and it wasn't 2012, it was 2021, right? But there is something fucked up in time. And the way that I think about time, the ways that I think about time, are not like ordinary linear time. They're much more like the relationship we have with time in dreaming, where weeks can happen in an instant, or the opposite, like, what would the opposite be? What's the opposite of weeks happening in an instant? An instant taking months to happen, right? But in my view of temporality, the past and the future are intimately connected to the now, so that things that we do now change the past, and things that we do now change the future. It's easy to see how this is impossible with rational thought. We think what has happened, it's done, right? You can't change it. From that perspective, that's not untrue, but that perspective is extremely limited and has very little to do with the actual nature of time. Because if, for example, I were to do something so astonishingly beautiful right now that all the living beings on Earth like leapt up and started celebrating, and it's not impossible to do these kinds of things, then that would change the meaning of everything that happened before, right? Because now everything that happened before led up to that moment in the now where something incredibly healing and beautiful happens, you see? And so the meaning of whatever happened before can be changed by what we do now. And I think it may even be that history can be affected structurally by what we do now. That's a more elaborate and exotic thought. My point, however, is that time is a multi-layered array of related flows that influence each other. Some flow backward, some flow forward, some go back and forth, some vibrate, right? There's this sort of layered blanket of topologies that are influencing and relating with each other as temporality. And something shifted very dramatically, and it's been shifting for some time. It's not like it happened all at once, and each person will have a unique experience of this, because we're all not merely in time in unique ways as embodied beings, and as beings who relate with other embodied beings who are in time uniquely. It's so sophisticated. It's really complex. It's nothing like tick-tock, linear time, this second follows that one. It's not like that. Actual temporality is magical in the sense that it's not like our rational thought at all. And something has fucked up in the time weave dramatically. I think I was aware of this possibility as long ago as 2002, and I had senses about what was coming and so on and so forth, but there was a pretty radical demarcation for me in 2018 around the end of the year, when it was a very sudden sense of something fundamental shifting in a way that is not good. And I've heard other people saying things like this, so that I know that it's not just like the people I know, or that I'm influencing the people that I'm talking with. I remember hearing a young boy telling his mother, "Mom, something's wrong in time." She's like, "What do you mean?" He was like 7 or something. And he said, "Last week happened 3 times. She's like, "I don't understand what you mean." And he said, "It was the same week 3 times in a row over 3 weeks. This is not the kind of thing a child would generally say." And I've heard lots of other people, just overheard conversations where they're like, "Something's fucked up with time. Have you noticed, like, time is a mess?" and people's dreaming. A lot of people are having really strange dreaming problems. And again, it's really important to understand everyone's in the game uniquely. So not everyone is going to have the same experience, even if there is something relatively universal going on. There's early sensors, there's mid-range sensors, there's close-range sensors, there's late sensors, there's extremely late sensors, and then there's people who don't sense it at all, right? So this is why when we say things about people in general, we're often very confused, because we're not thinking about topologies of peoples and cohorts, which is, I think, a better way of thinking about it. We're thinking about peoples as one thing. The people are one thing, which is impossible. That's just, it may seem rational, but it's actually irrationally ignorant to think that way. So I've become aware, and I've been chasing the questions around this for many, many years, but very diligently since 2018. And one of the perspectives that hadn't occurred to me previously, but I had a dream recently that was very strange. And in the dream, an event happened far ahead of us that sent shockwaves back toward us. And none of the people in the structure I was in were aware of this, and I kept telling them, look, we're in trouble. There's been a crash way ahead of us, and the shockwaves are coming back, and they're going to get more and more significant. We have to leave, right? We have to go somewhere. And the dream helped me understand the idea that there can be a catastrophe in the future, or a point at which the catastrophe becomes like a state change, right? The way that water boils at a certain state change. What's that word? Threshold? Or there's another word that I want that's even better. Maybe I won't find it right now, so I'll just continue with the thought. Or water can freeze at another state change threshold. And so that's a radical state change. And I think possibly what may turn out to be true is that at some point in the relatively near-term future, there's a temporal catastrophe, and it's sending shockwaves back into the present. And these waves, as they approach, right, as their peaks approach us and crash into us, we're lifted into, or we're dunked, we're dipped way down into a valley in the wave, right? The crest and I don't know what the crest and the dip. So I think possibly there's a catastrophe in the future, and we've been walking toward that point for a long time, but there's like evidence of a significant state change for me and for a number of people that I know. Again, not everybody's going to experience it the same way. We're all in the world, in our lives, in our bodies, at least to some degree uniquely. What's unfortunate is that we don't really have there's no good context to do sense making about this. Daniel Schmachtenberger talks about this a lot, and I really appreciate that guy and his capacity to elucidate the problems and the incredible importance of being able to make sense together around things that are happening, and how difficult that is for us these days. Not that it's necessarily been much better previously, but now we're in a cascading sort of network of crises. And so it's really important right now, and there's never been less sense-making going on, really, than there is now. There's this bizarre sort of authoritarian flavor to our social experience and the contexts in which modern humans are somewhat social, right? And so we see problems with censorship and declaration of what is true or good or reasonable to think or believe, particularly around COVID and the pandemic and the vaccines, which I find very, very troubling, because what we should be doing is science. If we're claiming to do science, we should be doing science. And if we're claiming to be doing visioneering, right, if we're claiming to be exploring what's going on with visionary faculties, then we should be doing that. But we're not doing either. Mostly we, meaning our societies and the people in general, our cultures, the parahuman intelligence collectives, the corporations, the governments, the sub-functions of the governments, and so on. There's no sense, there's very, very crude sense-making going on, and it's mostly declarative, and it mostly has to do with commerce. The primary agenda is to restore capitalism and commercialism and the commodity, situation where people are just buying things rather than having lives. I'm just paying attention to the bird for a moment. The bird is doing a dance, and it means something. It's communicating. Often this dance has to do with the nearby presence of a hawk, but it can also have to do with the sun setting and other things that I don't know. I mean, often it's much more useful to just admit that we don't know than to declare something and sort of bind ourselves to some camp of declarative knowledge about something, whether it's COVID or vaccines or politics or whatever. Because at least admitting that we don't know leaves the space. It doesn't collapse the space, right? And something is collapsing in time. And time is relation. So I think we're in a really dangerous situation that is very likely to turn into explicit crisis in the near-term future. But what I'm really more concerned about is understanding something, making some sense of this problem, and understanding something of the causal underpinnings of the problem. One of them that is very obvious to me, but it may not, it may be only a modest aspect of the trouble, is that you can't wipe out the anciently conserved ecologies and have human consciousness be unaffected. Right? Those anciently conserved ecologies are, our minds are organs of them, in my understanding. And so as we're burning those down, we're getting dumber. And the problem with that is you quickly get so dumb that you can't tell that you're burning down the thing that keeps making you dumber, right? Now you're going to fall off a cliff of stupidity into stupidity. So I've just had this sense for quite a while now that something's really broken in the temporal dimension of what's going on locally here on Earth. And there's a number of things that I think might be important to look at. And listen to. And attend. There may be no real solution. We may just kind of be fucked. But even if things are going to become incredibly grim, we will be better off having some knowledge about the origins of the problem, the causes, and I think it's important to realize that if we're struggling mentally, cognitively, physically, relationally, as so many people are, it may not be us. The context is undergoing radical pulses of change, and that's going to continue. Not everybody is feeling the same way I am. It's not a universal thing. But there are vast cohorts of people who are undergoing very similar things that I am experiencing. And I'm not going to detail what I'm experiencing here because No, there's a number of reasons. I have certain things I have to be cautious about, and other things that I don't want to suggest to people. But my experience is that most of the fairly sensitive people that I know are in crisis, and they have been for quite some time, and many of them long before the pandemic. So that's why I don't think it's the pandemic that's causing it. I think the pandemic is one of the features of the situation at the moment, this very novel thing that we've never really encountered anything like before. Last night in this garden I saw an oriole. Very rare thing to see around here. Very rare. So we're in a time storm. I think we're in a storm of turbulence in temporality, and temporality is relation. No temporality, no relation. If there are two things, now you can have time. If there's one thing, you can't, right? So in a way, the existence of temporalities depends on beings, and particularly physical beings, right? Incarnate beings. Because at least in the dimension of physicality, right? In the X-dimensional physicality that us incarnate creatures live in, we make time. We produce temporalities in relation. Something has crashed. I think there's a catastrophe in the near-term future that's sending shockwaves in time back to now. At least that's my current favored toy or perspective that I'm chasing at the moment to try to understand. And of course, I'll gladly drop that perspective if I can get something more interesting, or if I can get something to mix with it that produces better insight, right? I'm not trying to make a religion or declare the nature of things. I really am trying to explore and understand in a situation so strange that I've never encountered anything like it. And frankly, it's rather terrifying. The sensitive people I know are really suffering, almost all of them. So these are some of my thoughts this evening. And now as I'm leaving the garden, I guess I'll begin to wind down. I'll probably take up some threads of this discussion again in a future video. I just want to thank all of you and encourage you to remain vigilant and courageous. Summon to heart what hope you can muster. And let's walk through the darkness together with and for each other, and for the sake and welfare of all beings. Thank you for joining me. I hope I get to see you again soon.